Hi, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the respiratory system. As you can guess, the primary functions are exchange gases, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. And with most systems, there are secondary functions. So we've got produce vocal sounds, singing, talking. Um, there are a lot of evolutionary biologists that think that humans' ability to produce the widest range of vocal sounds is one of the things that separates the human species apart from some of our closest cousins. It's going to enable the sense of smell as you move air in and out of the nasal cavities where the smell receptors are. And finally, as you get rid of carbon dioxide, it's going to help you regulate blood pH. Respiration is a term that you guys have heard before in terms of cellular respiration, and this is the respiratory system. There's some specific terms that we need to apply here. So first of all, the physical movement of air in and out of the lungs is referred to as ventilation. So a ventilator is a machine whose job is to move air in and out of the lungs when a patient is no longer able, or temporarily able at least, to do it for themselves. Then there's gas exchange between the air pockets in the blood or between the blood and the air pockets, depending on if we're going in or out. That's referred to as external respiration. Then blood transports gases, but then at the tissue level, that's referred to as internal respiration, the gas exchange between the blood and the body cells at the capillaries. And then, of course, like I said, there is cellular respiration, which is that energy biochemical process.
In order to stay alive, the body has to breathe air. We breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. This process is known as respiration. Breathing happens automatically. Every day, the body breathes about 20,000 times. By the time we reach 70 years old, that's about 600 million breaths. All of this breathing occurs because of the respiratory system, which includes the nose, throat, voice box, windpipe, and lungs. At the top of the respiratory system, the nostrils bring air into the nose, where it's filtered, warmed, and moistened. Tiny hairs called cilia protect the nasal passageways and other parts of the respiratory tract and filter out dust and other particles that enter the nose through the breathed air. Air can also be breathed in through the mouth. The two airways of the nose and mouth meet up at the pharynx, which is located at the back of the throat. The pharynx carries both food and air and is used for digestion and respiration. One path is for food. This is called the esophagus, which leads onto the stomach. The other side is for air. It's called the trachea. A small flap of tissue, called the epiglottis, covers the air-only passage when we swallow. This stops food and liquid from going into the lungs. The larynx, or voice box, is located at the top of the trachea, the air-only pipe. This is where our vocal cords are. The trachea, or windpipe, which is a 2 to 3 centimeter tube, then extends downwards from the bottom of the larynx for about 12 centimeters. The walls of the windpipe are made strong by stiff rings of cartilage that keep it open. The trachea is also lined with tiny hairs. They sweep foreign particles and fluids out of the airway, keeping them from entering the lungs. The windpipe divides into two branches, and each one of these enters one of the two lungs of the body. Each branch resembles the limbs of a tree, dividing into smaller, finer branches called bronchioles. The bronchioles end in tiny air sacs called alveoli, which look a bit like grapes. These structures enable fresh air to get to the air sacs, which are surrounded by tiny blood vessels, or capillaries. The oxygen passes through these air sacs and travels through the capillary walls into the bloodstream. At the same time, carbon dioxide transfers from the bloodstream into the air sacs, where it gets breathed out of the body. When we exercise, the body needs more oxygen to feed the muscles as they work harder. The body responds by breathing more quickly and deeply. As the cells of the muscles use up more oxygen, the lungs have to work harder to keep up the supply. The respiratory system then speeds up to supply the body with much needed oxygen, and also to get rid of the carbon dioxide waste in the system. Over time, Exercising also helps our chest cavity to get bigger, which enables the body to increase the amount of air it takes in. More capillaries form around the air sacs, so the body gets better at swapping oxygen and carbon dioxide gases. We can see how the body's respiratory system helps the body to move about and is influenced by regular and ongoing physical activity as well.
Okay, so the respiratory system is generally divided into two groups or parts, the upper and lower respiratory tracts. Seen here in this diagram, and again here. So the upper respiratory tracts includes the nose. The nose is the beginning. Even though the mouth does connect to the respiratory tract, it's generally not considered part of the respiratory system, with our nose being the primary way that we get air in and out. The nose leads to the nasal cavity. Offshoots of that are the paranasal sinuses, and eventually the pharynx, and then the borderline is the larynx. And then that leads to the lower respiratory tract, trachea, bronchial tree, and the lungs. All right, so back to the nose. The nose is made of bones and cartilage and to give it support and shape. And then the nostrils are technically referred to as the nares. So nares is what little kids and some not so little kids stick their fingers up when they're trying to clear out their nose. And all of us have a certain amount of hair to filter out larger particles. Some people are just blessed with more hair than others. So then behind the nares are the nasal cavity, divided into right and left sides by the nasal septum. Within the nasal cavity are nasal conchae. Conchae sounds like the conch shells because of the spiral shape. Their main job, increase surface area. So there's three: superior, middle, inferior. And then this picture on the bottom is just showing us a deviated septum instead of the septum being right down the middle where it should be, either due to trauma or sometimes just congenital defect. It is deviated up to one side. And what we lose on this side generally is not made up for on the other side. So having a deviated septum can be limiting in how much air somebody can move in and out of their nasal cavity. And so a very common, not too difficult surgical procedure is surgery to fix a deviated nasal septum. Back to the conchae, again, remember their job is to increase surface area. Well, they're going to be covered extensively with mucous membranes. And what's the job of the mucus and the membrane is to warm and moisten the air on the way in, and also to trap particulate matter such as dust, allergens, pollen, anything that we don't want down deep in our lungs. So eventually all that stuff sticks to mucus. And so if the mucus is all up in here, very slowly it'll work its way down into the pharynx or the throat. And then once it's down in this region here, when we swallow, it continues its way down to the stomach for digestion. The sinuses, not really a true respiratory structure, but they're extensions of the nasal cavity. They're spaces. There are 4 of them: maxillary, frontal, ethmoid are all shown here on this picture. And then not shown on this picture are the sphenoid. You have to look in profile because they're basically right between the eyes. These two are lined with mucous membranes, and there's only small passageways that communicate out to the nasal cavity. So if these mucous membranes get inflamed, it can often trap off the sinuses. And so thus sinus infections can lead to feelings of pressure depending on where the infection might be. What's the job of, or why do we have these sinuses? They reduce the overall weight of the skull, and they provide a resonance chamber for our voice, for that, again, that wide variety of vocal sounds. And then we're going to get to the pharynx. What's the pharynx? It's a space. It's the throat. Really, it's the area at the far back of both the mouth and the nasal cavity. So this picture shows that the pharynx is actually divided or subdivided into 3 regions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and then the hypopharynx, where both those passageways, whether air or something else coming down the nose, air or food or liquid coming out the oropharynx, they all join and go into the hypopharynx. And then we get to the larynx. Again, the larynx is going to be the dividing line between the upper and lower, and that's the voice box. That's the voice box. It's a series of or framework of muscles and cartilage. So if you look at the picture here, we've got the hyoid bone. Again, that's that free floating bone, not connected to any other bones. It's got some membranes. The thyroid cartilage is the largest piece of cartilage. That is your Adam's apple. So when you put your finger at the front of your throat and feel that point, you are feeling this area right here. And in men, the thyroid cartilage tends to be bigger and more robust, and that's why most adult males, the point of the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple, is easily visible, and women, it's not quite as pronounced. And then you can see it ends in the cricoid cartilage, which if you slide your fingers down, you'll feel a couple irregular notches, and then you get to the cricoid cartilage, and then you're down to the trachea. Within the trachea is an area called the glottis. The glottis is just an opening, just like the pharynx is a space. It's not really a structure. The glottis is an opening. So in this picture, it's this dark area here. What forms? So we're peering from above down into the larynx. So we have the false vocal cords, which are basically just membranes that help completely close the glottis, close the space during swallows. And then these narrower, lighter colored bands are the true vocal cords. And that's what helps us produce sound. It's not the only thing. Clearly the tongue, the teeth, the lips are all involved in producing sounds. But the vocal cords are what vibrate to especially do changes in pitch. And how do we do that? If you've ever plucked a stringed instrument, a violin, a bass, a guitar, you change the tension on the string, you change the tension on the vocal cords, and you will change the pitch. The epiglottis is a flap-like structure, mostly cartilage. Normally it's standing straight upright. In this picture over here, this is the epiglottis. You can see it's here in this picture and here in this picture. Normally it's standing straight up and down, but when we swallow, it's going to come and help cover the glottis. And what's its job? It prevents choking. It prevents aspiration, which is the technical term for food or liquid entering the lungs. It can get swollen. It is called epiglottitis, and it can be life-threatening. This usually only happens in children. In proportion, their epiglottis is much bigger than in adults. So if this epiglottis swells, that's the itis, it can block off this entire opening, which means no air is going to get in and out. But more common condition in this area is called laryngitis. That's when the mucous membranes that line this region become swollen. And when these mucous membranes surrounding the vocal cords get swollen, then the vocal cords can't vibrate as freely, and we have laryngitis, or we lose our voice. Here is a video that shows us what it's like to see somebody's vocal cords. The epiglottis is seen in the bottom of this video footage. So that bright white that's taking up most of the video right now is the epiglottis. So the bright white, mostly connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue making up the vocal cords. And we'll see more of this in the next video, which is longer and provides a little bit more context.
Few of us think about the trauma we generate in our voice boxes when we talk, sing, laugh, or scream. But take a look down the talented gullet of Steven Tyler, Aerosmith's lead singer, and you get a feel for why he, and millions of others, are wreaking havoc on a delicate instrument. Okay. Tonight, as Aerosmith performs, Dr. Steven Zeitels and his team from Massachusetts General Hospital will get a rare treat. With the help of special monitoring equipment, they'll see how this famous pair of vocal cords holds up to such extremes. Dr. Zeitels, one time for my kids, what is this monitoring?
What we're going to be doing is looking at the vibrations on the skin of your neck, which is going to pick up the intensity of your voice. It's going to be picking up the loudness of your voice.
Thank you, Doctor.
Into the abyss.
Into the great beyond.
There we go.
Dr. Zeitels.
And that one,
Backstage, throughout tonight's concert, Zeitels will use an endoscope to examine Tyler's voice box up close.
see, can I have the course?
Try not to touch the sides.
Yep. Just breathe, say It's a rare insight into what goes on in a high performance singer.
Real-time measures of a performer who is at the top of his game, doing a live performance in front of thousands of people. It's a first. It hasn't been done before.
To produce these kinds of sounds, Tyler's vocal cords are slamming together an average of 170 times a second. That's more than 500,000 times during the course of a concert. And nearly 1 billion times during the course of his 30-year professional career.
There's no part of the human body that likely sees these kinds of collision forces and shearing stresses, which is why vocal folds essentially wear out over time.
It's also why just months earlier, damaged vocal cords canceled much of Aerosmith's tour. Tyler could barely sing. Forcing him to undergo Zeitels' knife, or laser in this case.
Steven basically had a vocal bleed, which is very common in performers.
Common, in fact, to many with the gift of gab. From attorneys to telemarketers. The laser surgery, which Zeitels and his team pioneered, works by sealing off damaged vessels to stop the bleeding. These aren't some Photoshop tricks you're looking at. This is Steven Tyler's voice box, and these are his fragile blood vessels disappearing. He was able to zap those blood vessels, so I go out there and just sing and hope for the best. Now, as Steven heads on stage, his finely tuned vocal cords spring into action, and we get a front row seat. This is Steven Tyler outside. And in. Every time that I look in the mirror, always lights on my face, getting clearer. Every time we exhale, we force air through our two membranous vocal cords. When we bring them together, they vibrate. These vibrations produce sound, much like a guitar string after it's been plucked. Muscles open and close the cords and change the sound's pitch. During low notes, the cords are loose and vibrate more slowly. But for those falsettos, his cords stretch to the limit and vibrate virtually off the charts. A surprisingly simple feat for Tyler's pliable cords.
I mean, to go from, I woke up this morning on the wrong side of the bed, and all them things you saying, and all them things I said, but it's in that voice. And then, of course, and I don't want to miss a thing, is in that voice, and then Dream On is, Dream On, Dream On! And they've asked me before, how do you sing that song every night? Well, that's one of the easiest ones for me to sing. Go.
As for what translates these vocal vibrations into song, that happens much farther up. In the throat, the mouth, the tongue, the nose. These are what put the stamp on human sound, distinguishing the likes of Steven Tyler from just about anyone else. After some 2 hours of vocal gymnastics, initial data revealed that Tyler's cords crashed together more than 500,000 times and covered the equivalent of more than 6 miles. And there's no indication they'll be wearing out anytime soon.
Thank you!
Dramatic as it may be, singing is a side effect of a much more crucial process. The real reason why air passes through our mouths is breathing. We wouldn't survive much more than a couple of minutes if we didn't. With every inhale, our noses or mouths suck in about a pint of air, some 20,000 times a day. We can follow it on its journey, down the throat, past the voice box, and into the windpipe or trachea. As it approaches the lungs, air has a choice, left or right, but both lungs lead to the same end. The lungs' bronchi divide and divide into thousands of smaller and smaller branches, progressively filtering chemicals, dust, and smoke in the air, until finally they come to an end in this pouch-like ball called an alveolus. More than 300 million of them spread across each lung, with a combined surface area roughly a third the size of a tennis court. In less than a second, oxygen molecules exit the lungs here through walls just 1 cell thick. They'll then cross into a surging bloodstream, be whisked throughout the body, and provide precious resources to every one of our trillions of cells. Assuming air gets to this point, the blue here shows how a healthy lung empties oxygen into the bloodstream. In this smoker's lung, oxygen can't empty nearly as well. Then there's the exhale. Carbon dioxide, the waste product of breathing, makes the opposite journey back out. Another inhale, and our breathing apparatus offers yet another gift, with delightful or disgusting results. With every new breath, our noses can distinguish as many as 10,000 different odors. Some pleasing, some not. They can calm, caution, or make our mouths water. But the essence of any aroma, from a day at the beach to fresh-baked bread, is pure chemistry. Isobutyl acetate, vanillic acid, and more than 300 different chemicals, for example, come together to give chocolate its unmistakable bouquet. A rose by any other name might be phenylethyl alcohol. And once fish is past its prime, it owes its stench to trimethylamine, a
byproduct of the bacteria growing inside it. Whatever the chemical, deep inside our noses, there's a small patch of about 10 million cells waiting to sniff it out. These cells carry about 1,000 different kinds of receptors on their surfaces. When the right odor chemical meets up with the right receptor, an electrical signal gets sent to the brain, and finally, the incredible machine smells. All in all, our respiratory systems are ingenious multitaskers, sorting thousands of smells at each intake, capable of making thousands of sounds on the way out. But no matter how pleasant the byproduct, there is a higher calling to breathing. Every breath we take delivers oxygen to our trillions of power-hungry cells and gets our hearts to pump.
And what's not mentioned there when it talks about Steven Tyler is professional vocalists often have a very meticulous regimen to keep their vocal cords and their larynx in good shape. I don't know enough to tell you the different tricks, but I know vocal teachers, vocal coaches can tell you that there are good ways and bad ways to sing that can damage or keep your vocal cords healthy, as we saw there with Steven Tyler. So moving past the vocal cords, moving past the larynx, air enters the trachea, or perhaps the trachea if you want to be understood in Britain. But you and I would usually just call it the windpipe. Flexible cylinder with cartilage rings. So the cartilage rings keep it open, but it is very flexible and very lightweight. Lined with ciliated mucous membrane. Going back to tissues, you might remember that this is pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. That's what a trachea would look like in a dissected person. And then this leads us to the bronchial tree. The first video made reference to the tree, and so think of it as a tree that's upside down. So here's the larynx, air coming down, and then it just continues to further subdivide. So the bronchial tree is going to start with bronchi, singular bronchus, right and left bronchus. Those are going to subdivide into smaller bronchioles, and then even bronchioles, we can have multiple divisions of bronchioles that we'll see in subsequent slides. And eventually, the last tube you're in is called an alveolar duct, and then you get to the alveoli. As again the video said, it looks like a cluster of grapes, and that's where gas exchange occurs. So again, notice that there can be a bronchial, terminal bronchial, respiratory bronchial, and then not labeled here, but you can kind of get a sense for one right in here, alveolar duct, before you reach the alveoli. The lungs themselves are very spongy. You think about if you take all of the air out of the lungs, then the mass collapses greatly. So just think of it as a series of microscopic balloons all clustered together. So the lungs, very spongy and can change their volume pretty greatly. Found in the pleural cavity. If you look at the lungs themselves, the right lung is subdivided into 3 lobes, and interestingly, the left lung only has 2 lobes. Just an interesting quirk of our development. Lining the pleural cavity is going to be the pleural membrane, And so just like in the pericardial cavity, you're going to have serous fluid secreted by that serous membrane that's going to prevent any friction between the lungs that are expanding and contracting and the wall of the pleural cavity that is not moving at all. You can see also on the left lung that there's a space called the cardiac notch, because the heart, most of it is midline, but some of the mass of the heart is to the left side of the sternum, and so the left lung has a space carved out because that's where the pericardial cavity will take up that space with the heart. All right, so that's where I'm going to leave it off, and the next PowerPoint or the next presentation is going to be how we breathe, as well as some problems and disorders of breathing.